Hi everybody, thanks for joining today. This is the second of our webinars on using your data to drive growth in mobile money services, the mobile money customer journey with a gender lens. My name's Oliver Roundtree. I'm an insights manager with the Connected Women team at the GSMA. So, if it's not clear from the title, this webinar is all about our data analysis methodology for how to look at your data and better target women with that. So I'll just run through a quick agenda for the webinar. So first of all, I'll give it a bit of an introduction to GSMA, to Connected Women, and to what we do, how we work with operators. Then I'll get into a little bit more of the customer segmentation, the specifics of how we approach this from the very start. Then we'll dive into a little bit more detail on analyzing the customer journey specifically and some of our methodology around that. And then finally, some areas for further study, further analysis, and potentially further qualitative follow-up research. This might be questions that the analysis raises and things like that. So just some admin on questions. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the entire presentation. Depending on the questions that we get, I may aim to answer some at the ends of each section, or otherwise I'll just leave them all to the end. And if there's anything that is a bit more in depth, we can follow up offline. So, to jump into some introductions, many of you listening may be already very familiar with us, but the GSMA is a trade association representing all the mobile operators worldwide. Connected Women specifically is a team aimed at addressing the gender gap in the customer base of mobile operators, particularly in emerging markets. We do this for a number of reasons. We do this to help our members and bring benefits to the industry from a commercial perspective. We do this to benefit women who we think can gain a lot from access to mobile services, whether it be the internet, whether it be financial services, and then to bring benefits to society at large. So Connected Women's approach is to help operators in addressing the gender gap in mobile internet access and mobile money access in their customer base. So our focus is primarily around usage rather than phone ownership. We typically work with operators or organizations partnered with operators, providing advisory support, analysis where necessary, a host of support to help our partners address the gender gap in their subscriber base. So the question that we're trying to address with this webinar is basically, what is our suggested approach to addressing the gender gap in an operator's subscriber base? And one place to start is to use your data to better understand where this is coming from and potentially develop theories of how you might address that. So really, we recommend looking at your in-depth, at your transactional data, and specifically forming a customer journey as a framework to do this data analysis. This methodology isn't intended to be entirely comprehensive or overly prescriptive. This is just a framework that has worked for us in analysis that we've done, but we absolutely advocate that this should be market specific. It should be specific to the questions that you're trying to address in your market. And it's not even necessarily limited to mobile money. This could be used for mobile services more generally, financial services. Really, it's just a thought process that one can go through and a way of approaching data. I'll just add that all of the data in these slides is dummy data. It's not specific to any market. It's not real data, but where it is saying specific things about usage patterns, it is aiming to at least somewhat reflect the realities that we see in the markets that we work in terms of disparities, in terms of urban rural penetration, things like that. So not a specific market, but not entirely fictional either. So the objectives of the analysis that we're trying to lay out today is really, there's multiple parts to it. Firstly, it's to size the gender gap that's the first step that we would advocate for anybody looking to look into this problem. Understand the scale of the issue. The second is to start identifying the priority customer segments that you want to do things to address, whether it's the low-hanging fruits, whether that be rural women, where it's those who you feel are the best segments to target with your commercial strategy. Thirdly, it's to, in more depth, understand at what stage of the mobile money customer journey potential female customers are being lost. So understanding where along the process from understanding through to adoption of services, women are disproportionately not continuing that journey. Finally, it's to develop strategies and actionable recommendations for how to address this problem. And one thing to add here is that this analysis will aim to tell you what is happening from your data and in your subscriber base, but it won't necessarily go all the way to telling you why that's happening. You might be able to develop theories and hypotheses, but we would suggest that to really answer that why question, it requires follow-up research, quantitative and qualitative, to understand the motivations of consumers. And some of this work we've done ourselves, and I'll link to some reports at the end of this presentation that I'd recommend as further reading if you want to get into a little bit more of that detail. So to give a little bit more context for what I'm talking about when I say the gender gap. So this is, in the most basic sense, just the disparity in ownership, registration, or usage of a service between men and women. The way that we calculate this is the percentage of men registered or using a service minus the percentage of women registered or using the service divided by men, and that's the gender gap. This equation aims to correct for penetration of services. So in effect, it's a relative calculation that shows more accurately the disparity when penetration is perhaps low in a market. So there are three phases to the analysis that I'm going to lay out today. The first is customer segmentation across usage and demographics. I'll get into that in the next couple of slides. The second is mapping the segmented data along a mobile money customer journey. And then finally, it's to deep dive on specific segments and answer the questions that this analysis of this stage has raised. There's a lot of questions that we would hope would be both raised and answered through this process. A few examples are: what percentage of men try different services, where the gender gap is largest and smallest geographically and within certain segments, which segments are most likely to act as influencers, which is to say perhaps to prompt a new potential subscriber to use your service by interacting with them, which segments exhibit the highest usage sophistication, which is to say using the broadest range of services, which segments are most or least likely to try the service after registration. So a lot of these are hopefully helpful things to answer in themselves, but also potentially raise further questions or strategies that one might adopt. For example, if you find that women are less likely to try the service after registration, it might imply that agents should be incentivized to encourage usage at the point of registration, which is an issue that we've potentially seen in some markets that we've worked in. So just to cover some of the specifics before we dive into the segmentation, there's a few data sets that are required for this analysis and a few data sets that are nice to have. We would say that there are two that are necessary for this. There is transactional data and subscriber data. The transactional data represents is a large data set where each row will represent an individual mobile money transaction between a sender and a receiver. The data should be generated automatically by the database or system, and it should have a sender and a receiver, MSISDN or account number, the amount transacted, a type of transaction, timestamp, all of this information automatically generated and accurate. Secondly, there's the subscriber data set, which will perhaps be less accurate as much of it is manually entered. It should include an account number or phone number, which should marry up with the transactional data set. So the two should be able to communicate with one another. it should also include information about the type of account, like whether it's a subscriber or whether it's an agent or a merchant, so that might be in the same data set. It should include demographic background information such as age and, crucially, gender, although all of this may be partial or inaccurate, which I'll get onto in a moment, and it should include when the account was registered. So other data sets which are definitely helpful to have, but aren't perhaps completely necessary to do some form of analysis, are things like call detail records, which is a larger data set which includes all of the behavior of a subscriber on the GSM as well as mobile money side. So that's things like phone calls, SMS sent, and that can give some really helpful contextual data on how high value a customer is, how active they are with different services, how many people they interact with, and things like that. You might also have agent data. This might be included in your subscriber data set and can also be very useful for some forms of analysis around agent interaction, which I'll get into a little bit later. There's location data, which could come from a couple of different sources, but it's very important for being able to do things like urban-rural segmentation, which we would suggest is an important additional layer of demographic segmentation that you do on your data. This might be included in the CDR data, but it might also be included with the subscriber at the point of registration, in which case it will be rather less accurate, most likely, and be manually inputted. Finally is demographic data from sort of national data sets, whether that be national statistics offices or international organizations like the UN. This is important to be able to contextualize the data that you have in your subscriber data set. For example, talking about overall penetration of your service within the market, but also penetration of more specific subsegments within the population, different age categories, things like that. So one thing just to acknowledge and to highlight is that reliable gender data is definitely important for this analysis, but we absolutely recognize that in many data sets, gender data is partial, it may be inaccurate, it may be difficult to access. It all depends on how it's collected, what the KYC requirements are in a market. It may be that men often register on behalf of a woman, and then a woman will actually be using the account. All of this kind of limits the accuracy of gender data, and it's absolutely, it is an issue, but it's worth doing this analysis even if you fear that your gender data is partial or inaccurate, because it will always tend to be more accurate than completely random. And also there are things that you can do to try and validate the gender of your subscriber base. So things like doing a telephone survey, even on a small scale, to check what percentage of people who are registered as a certain gender are actually that gender, or are the primary user of that account. If you expand the number in that telephone survey, you could even use that sample as the data that you use for your analysis. Although that limits the scope of your analysis, it can still be meaningful and accurate as long as it's a random sample of your customer base. You can also do automated checks, like checking the names in your subscriber base against the database of known names from that country. Or you can even do more sophisticated machine learning type analysis to assess gender based on usage patterns, but that's obviously a more sophisticated approach to take and a bit more challenging. Finally, a longer term solution is to use the agent network to validate subscriber gender data during customer interactions. This isn't necessarily the easiest thing to do, and it's something that needs to be incentivized and implemented over a longer time period, but we would recommend that it's something that's worth considering if gender analysis is something that you want to do with your data. So I'll jump into the next section around customer segmentation straight away then. So assuming that you've collected your data and matched up your data sets, we would recommend two initial forms of segmentation, two initial approaches, which both are very valuable and both tell you helpful things about your customer base. The first is to look at usage to segment your customer base. We would recommend that this kind of segmentation be based on at least 3 months of behavior by your subscribers, as if less time is used, it may be less robust, it may be less indicative of the overall behavior patterns of that subscriber. Secondly is demographic segmentation based on things like age, gender, urban, rural, and we would recommend that you cut across a few different demographics when you do this analysis. I'll go into a little bit more on demographics now and cover usage types later on. So here's a few examples of the kinds of demographic splits that we recommend. It's nothing too outside of the box, nothing too unorthodox. It's simply looking at gender, age category, and urban and rural. So simply splitting out into 12 categories that is cut along all of those lines. We would recommend that if you're looking to do more cuts than that, it may complicate your first pass of analysis. So 12 is perhaps a good number to aim for in the first place. So this is what that might look like when it's actually implemented on a data set. And this is, as I say, dummy data, so not necessarily representative of any specific market, but where the darker bars represent the penetration of each segment, and the width of that bar represents the size of that segment in terms of the number of people in the population within it. This kind of heavy penetration of urban areas compared to lower penetration of rural areas is certainly common to the markets that we've looked at. Also, similarly, lower levels of penetration amongst the female base is also common, and which would often lead us to conclude that urban women are often a good opportunity for operators to target because the infrastructure is already there. It's simply a case of making the case that there are use cases for women within those areas, whereas perhaps reaching rural men and women is more challenging in terms of infrastructure. So having covered demographics, I'll now get a little bit more into segmentation based on usage patterns and behavior and the customer journey framework that we recommend. So at a top level, the customer journey aims to represent the process that a potential subscriber goes through from the point of initial awareness of mobile money as a concept, through to registration, through to trialing the product, through to more regular usage, and potentially even much heavier usage further down the line. There's kind of two broad categories to this customer journey, and only one of these can we really address through this transactional data analysis that we're talking about today. The point before registration, by definition, doesn't show up in the transactional data that we have. So that is something that really needs to be looked into through other forms of research, whether quantitative or qualitative, but it's absolutely important for understanding the overall customer journey of women within your market and of men, and understanding what are the barriers to registration, because often, even by the point of registration, you see there being a significant gender gap in your subscriber base. Beyond that, it's simply about making meaningful categories that show the progression through to more heavy usage of the service. So the first stage in doing this customer journey segmentation is to define the stages of the customer journey, making meaningful stages which represent and reflect the realities in your market, the levels of sophistication that you see as prevalent within your user base. And making sure that within each of those categories there are a substantial enough number of people based on the definition you've decided that it's a meaningful subsegment. The second is to split out that customer journey by gender and do a deeper dive on where the barriers seem to be for progression along that customer journey for women. So here's the framework that Connected Women in the Mobile Money team at GSMA tend to use for this work. So it's all focused on post-registration, and as you can see there are percentages which show the progression from each category to the next. So taking, for example, the unregistered category, that is to say, that would be your entire customer base. For an operator, that would be the entire GSM base, with the percentage representing the share of that base that progresses to the next stage of the journey, which is to register for mobile money. The next percentage would represent that number of registered subscribers who have then actually tried mobile money at any point. The next stage would be those who are regular users, so percentage of trialers who have become regular users, whether that be trying mobile money at least once over the last 3 months, or whether it be some higher threshold of usage. That would really have to depend on the specifics of the market that's being analyzed, as in more mature markets, one payment over 3 months would be a very, very low level of usage, whereas in others that's more consistent with the overall level of usage in the market. Finally, we would recommend having some kind of power usage stage to represent the really engaged, really high volume users. For example, making 5+ payments per month with multiple counterparties. We would recommend that based on the specifics of the market being looked at, again, this power usage stage is defined very specifically. You might also have a stage beyond this that represents the really, really high value customers that you aim to retain and to push your customer base towards. So the next step would be then to split this customer journey out by gender. So that is to say, where for each subscriber in your data set, you have assigned them a category which they fall into based on the usage pattern over the time period that you're looking at. You could also assign a user category for each time period, for example, for each quarter that you're analyzing to track how that changes over time, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on. And then you simply split that out by gender, which you should have with it, associated with at least some proportion of your customer base. And this is where, as a first pass, you simply try and understand the points at which women are disproportionately not continuing along the journey that you've defined throughout this process. Again, this is just dummy data, but it's these kinds of patterns are what we've seen in terms of there often being specific stages where women disproportionately drop off compared to men. And then at other stages, they tend to progress at a similar rate to men to the more advanced stages. So really here, this is where you start to raise the questions that you then want to answer in further deep dives on your data. Why is this happening? And you can also do this customer journey for more specific sub-segments, age categories, more geographically specific segments. Really, we would recommend this be the cornerstone of your analysis to understand where you're losing women. So finally, having done that process, gone through that process and developed a customer journey framework, we would recommend that you start to do deep dives on the specific segments and the specific questions that you've raised through that process. So some examples of the kinds of deep dives that we recommend, and this is by no means exhaustive. We would really recommend that you try and go through this process to raise the questions that you want to look into in more depth. I would also recommend the full version of this report and a number of other reports that I'll give links to later for further questions that you might look into, as well as the kinds of questions that we've asked the data in the past. So an obvious next step would be to look at demographic splits on more specific cuts of subscriber data and types of usage. So doing the customer journey for specific demographic subsegments. Gender disaggregated analysis of time series data to look at how behavior and engagement changes over time for male and female categories. Focusing on specific stages of the customer journey and really breaking that out in much more depth demographically, geographically, those priority segments where you're seeing that you're losing customers disproportionately, really deep diving on that can be a great way of informing your strategy and really understanding where are the blockages to you gaining and retaining more high value subscribers. A more specific one would be to look at the geography, to map your users across your country. To look at penetration and usage by region, and also to map that by different user categories. A final point is around networking effects, to visualize how interactions between different subscribers motivates them to become more actively engaged, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on. So one thing I would lay out here is that the customer journey framework that we've recommended is, as I say, by no means exhaustive, and we would recommend that you try and reflect the realities in your market, but also try and capture the journeys of different kinds of customers within your base. So, for example, post-registration, some may not trial the service, but some may be passive recipients of P2Ps. So they may receive and then cash out. So they still play a part in your overall social network of your mobile money service, but you might want to build strategies around how you incentivize them to more actively use the service, whether that be keeping the money in their mobile money wallet, moving it over to specific savings products, or themselves doing P2P transfers. You might find those who have tried the service and then actively rejected it. Those might be good targets for further follow-up research, what they didn't like about the service, why it didn't fulfill their needs, and understanding how you can avoid that with future new subscribers. And then finally, with power users, those who have been regular or power users and then are no longer in that high usage category, you might want to understand what's changed, whether it is, again, that you are not providing the right level of service or the right specific product suite to keep them within your subscriber base, or indeed whether you're losing them to competitors. That might be something that requires further follow-up research or can be answered just through the data itself. So I touched on this very briefly earlier on, but one thing that you can do is deep dive on the role of agents and how agent interaction maps against gender, against demographic splits. This can inform your understanding of the importance of your agent network, how well it's performing for certain subsegments. Depending on the exact nature of your data set, you may know the gender of your agents or you may not. We have seen in some markets that female agents tend to have more success in engaging female subscribers. So this is something that could perhaps be looked into and could inform future rollout of agent networks. Perhaps it might be worth providing incentives for new female agents to come on board, or looking at more proactive outreach to female groups if they are not responding well to your pre-existing agent network. Another one I've touched on so far is looking at how your subscriber base changes over time, how engagement of previous high-value customers changes over time, whether you're retaining them well or whether you're seeing them disengage. So this might imply that something about your products aren't fulfilling their needs, or it might mean that you need to adjust your pricing structure, or it might mean that you might need to improve your marketing to that subsegment. We would recommend that this is absolutely something that should be looked into with a deeper dive in the data, as well as potentially follow-up research as well. And the final example that I'll show, and as I say, these are by no means exhaustive, and you can find more examples of the kinds of visualizations and analysis that you can do with your data in the full version of this report, which you can find on our website. But this chart here shows flows of P2Ps between different user segments. So, for example, where rural women are sending P2P transfers to different demographic segments like rural women, rural men. In this instance, rural women showing up as disproportionately passive recipients of P2Ps, which again, while this is not real data, it is perhaps reflective of something that we've seen in other markets. This can be helpful in itself to understand how certain segments behave and what role they play in your network. As I mentioned before, although rural women, for example, could be more passive recipients, they could play an essential role in incentivizing more active users of P2P transfers to use the service to be able to, for example, send money home. You could also do this to understand how certain segments are interacting with new users, how social networks inform usage. So which segments interact with the most different, the most subscribers and the most new subscribers, to really understand which categories are driving usage the most. So I think these kinds of transfer flow diagrams can be a really powerful visualization to understand the interactions within your network. So that's everything in terms of content that I wanted to run through. I would just, as I've mentioned a couple of times, recommend a bit of follow-up reading. If you've been interested in this analysis process, I'd recommend the mobile money teams getting the most out of your data, segmenting your mobile money customer base to drive usage. There are also more technical notes which underpin this analysis that give really in-depth specifics around how to approach this analysis, the kinds of software, the kinds of databases that you would need, and you can contact the mobile money team to get those technical notes. Or feel free to get in touch with me at oroundtree@gsma.com with any specific questions, or if you want to have access to those notes as well. In terms of the content that we've covered, there's a few different reports that we have looking at mobile money uptake of women in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. We'll also shortly be publishing a report which gives more detail on this customer journey framework applied end-to-end, including awareness in a number of sub-Saharan African markets. So I'd recommend that you also read that report when it is published in the next couple of months. So I'll open the floor up to questions, and I'm happy to answer any queries you may have. So one specific one is whether we'll be sharing a copy of this deck. Absolutely, we can send you a copy of this afterwards, but it's heavily based on a report that we published at the end of last year on this topic. So I'd recommend, if you're interested in this, read that report in full, but absolutely happy to send over any versions of that. One question is around the minimum size of data set that's required to do this analysis. And I would say that in most instances, the kinds of data sets that are coming from mobile money systems will be large enough that that's not an issue. Generally being sort of thousands to millions of rows of data. However, the minimum that would really be required for this analysis to be meaningful would be sort of 500 to 1,000, depending on the level of depth you want to go into within the certain subsegments. So that's, of course, particularly relevant if you're having to do telephone checks on your data to validate the gender of your base. So I'd recommend, if that's the approach that needs to be taken, then 500 to 1,000 would be a minimum, ideally each for men and women. So one question is around my assessment of how many MNOs are using this type of exercise to evaluate their mobile money business. I think that it varies a lot by market. I think that most are doing some kind of analysis of data, but not necessarily in so much depth or with so much of a clear structure. Few are looking specifically at gender, and this is really what motivated us to do this in the first place, that we see gender as being, from a pure commercial perspective, a really vital demographic cut that is being understudied and can really inform operators as to how better to target their business. So in short, I think a lot of operators are looking at this data, but perhaps not in a structured enough way and not in enough depth, and certainly not covering gender to the necessary level. So now the question is around using this journey for other applications like mHealth. So this isn't something that I've worked on personally, although I know similar kinds of frameworks are used throughout the GSMA, for example. The customer journey is hardly specific to mobile money. I think that very much the same logic applies. I think that simply taking a step back and looking at how your usage categories differ and how that differs by gender is a really valuable exercise. The specifics would be around the quality and the structure of data and the degree to which you can tie that to operator data. So part of the strength of doing this analysis with mobile money specifically is there's quite a lot of contextual data about subscribers, and you can do it with a very large data set, which can be quite reliable just by virtue of the volume. So those are advantages, but also have their disadvantages and their challenges. So there would be some differences methodologically, and certainly the segments would need to be sort of customized for whatever service was being analyzed, but definitely the same logic would apply. So unless there are any other questions, I'll just give another minute in case anybody has any others they want to raise. So there's one on whether MNO technical platforms allow for easy access to this type of data. Again, I would say that varies significantly, but often not. The reality is that often these data sets are stored in different databases. They don't very naturally communicate with one another. They are owned by different teams, and they haven't already been joined. And I would say that maybe this is the point of literal and figurative disconnect that can be addressed through this process, is combining these data sets to provide a coherent understanding of your subscriber base. But the reality is that often this data is not very clean and not very consistent, and so that is a big part of the time investment that's required in doing this analysis, understanding the structure of the data and ensuring uniformity between the different data sets. So there's one question that touches on a previous point raised around the potential approach when the gender data is partial or not fully identified. So there's no easy fix in reality, but there are a few approaches that I would recommend beyond what I've highlighted already. So the most sophisticated and potentially reliable form of extrapolation is to sort of use a source input data set and then build machine learning algorithms to look at the behavior of that data set and extrapolate out to the rest of your data set. It is limited in how far it can get in terms of accuracy, just based on the statistical realities, but that is the most ambitious approach. Other things can be done just in terms of the likelihood, for example, that a subscriber is at home at certain times of the day. So that would require very accurate location tracking data, which would need to be taken from the GSM database. But for example, in some markets, we've seen analysis done on if somebody is at home both during the day and during the evening, they're more likely to be a woman because that would be more likely to be a housewife, and therefore you can at least somewhat assume assume the gender of that subscriber. But again, none of these approaches are ever going to be perfect, and really it needs to longer term be a multi-pronged approach to improve the quality of gender data to be able to do this analysis in a meaningful way. Right. Well, thank you very much for the questions. I hope this has been helpful, and I would be very happy to have any follow-up questions sent to me directly, or very happy to have follow-up calls to talk through any of the specific parts of this process in more depth. So thank you very much for joining, and look forward to hearing from you.